blue dots are representing lithium. There's some other colored dots. The red dots are cobalt. There's some dark blue dots. Don't focus on those for now. Like, let's just focus on lithium. There's some larger gray dots that represent cells. So really, how this supply chain works is there's the production of raw materials at the front end. There's a refining step where you actually take those raw materials and you make them into something pure. Purity is a really, really important piece for this industry. You have to meet a spec in order to qualify to be part of a battery as an electric vehicle. From there, it gets made into cathode. The cathode gets combined with an anode and an electrolyte to be made into a cell. And then your cells get packed together ultimately into a pack and into a battery management system, and then into a car. So we can draw a parallel here a little bit to the oil industry, that the production of the raw materials is kind of our upstream activity. And then our refining is similar, that we tend to send our oil out of the country to be refined in the United States. There's similar things going on in the lithium industry, kind of depending on where you are. And then either the downstream is really anything to do with making the pack and placing it into an EV. So if you'll come with me on a journey, let's start in Australia. Australia has hard rock mines, so they make lithium by blasting and grinding in an open pit mine and making essentially a concentrate ore. And that ore is the precursor material, that's the raw materials mining. That ore gets sent, you can see that arrow going up to China, up to that blue dot in China. And China has a series of converters, and they convert that precursor product into a raw material. Now, briefly, I'll just draw your attention away from the map to the little graph on the bottom right. What that's showing is that China is really dominating this industry in terms of battery manufacturing. Today, they're responsible for 73% of the battery manufacturing in the world, and that's predicted to remain the same really as we see. I'll talk a little bit later about the growth of the industry. So let's switch gears a bit and start in South America, where roughly the other half of the lithium in the world comes from. So in South America, it's a brine source, which is more similar to what we have in Alberta. We have a brine source in Alberta. The lithium's dissolved in the brine. That brine in South America gets pumped to the surface and then evapoconcentrates for a year to 2 years, and ultimately gets processed into either a precursor material or it gets refined. You'll notice that some of the lithium from South America comes up to the United States, makes a pit stop. That's a refining step. And then it makes its way over to China, again, to be packed into those battery cells. So when you think about the supply chain, one of the kind of glaringly obvious things on this graph or this map is that North America is not really playing a big role. In particular, Canada is not really playing much of a role at all. And I think that we can change that. I think that we can really move the needle on that moving forward. The dominance that China has in the market really, at the end of the day, translates to a dependence on China. This is increasingly, making the headlines in terms of the globalization of the supply chain, and especially even with COVID, how we need to be working within that framework to essentially establish an energy or supply chain security for ourselves, for our energy future, because lithium is such a key part of defense and electrification and energy. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk a little bit about the market so that we can understand where Alberta can fit in the growth of this industry. So next slide. Okay, so 3 graphs here. I know this is busy, so just bear with me a bit. On the left, this is just supply and demand. So the supply is represented by these bars. It's in units of lithium carbonate equivalent. That's our lingo in the oil and gas, or in the lithium industry, similar to oil and gas, like you'd hear the BOE getting kicked around. Lithium carbonate equivalent is just a way of measuring different lithium compounds and equating them together. By the way, lithium tends to, the major product is a salt product, which essentially looks like your table salt. So it's measured in tons. So you can see those bar graphs, and then the line is showing the demand. You can see at around 2025, there's a diversion of those two data sets, and that's where the supply crunch, if you're looking at the lithium market, is anticipated to happen. That's a pretty big wedge. That's not really including types of projects like Alberta's that could come in and really fill in that wedge. Now, what's driving that demand? It's really the graph in the middle, the EV adoption. So a whole bunch of different colors there. All those are representing are different car companies and all the different models they're coming out with. So you'll be able to walk into the dealership and have a whole bunch of choices with respect to the type of car that you could buy that would be electric. And then in terms of whether or not that's going to be the same price as an internal combustion engine, that's the graph on the right. So over time, what we've seen is the price curve come down on these batteries. And there's a couple of things behind that. One of them is that things are getting more efficient. We're scaling. These mega factories are coming online. There's been a 5 times growth in the last 9 years in terms of how much battery mega factory capacity there is, and that's anticipated to just keep on growing. But then there's also the technology. You only have so much space in a car, and you want to pack, efficiency and range into that space. So that's part of that price curve coming down, and ultimately you're going to be able to walk in the dealership and buy an EV for the same price as an internal combustion engine. So that's what's going on behind the scenes with respect to the lithium market. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so Alberta. This is the reason we're all here, right? We want to talk about how Alberta can play in this space. The first thing you need to know about lithium in Alberta is that it is really, really similar to oil and gas. So in oil and gas, we are producing fluids to the surface from a well, and typically we're separating out water. Water is coming out, and then we're re-injecting that water back into the subsurface, or it's being carted away. And we're using pipelines and pumps and wells and surface locations to do that. Same deal with lithium. And in fact, one of the most notorious reservoirs in Alberta, the Leduc Reservoir, it's delivered millions of barrels of oil for the province for 70 years, actually. That reservoir is one of Alberta's most important reservoirs for lithium as well. And on a volume basis, actually contains 95% brine. So when you look at how we would be extracting lithium, we're going to be drilling wells, pumping that brine to the surface, taking the lithium out, and then re-injecting the brine back into the subsurface, into the same reservoir, and essentially flushing it out. So when you look at it from that perspective, and I'm not going to ignore that we need lithium processing. We obviously need that, and I'll be talking about technology in a little bit. But really, what this looks like is wells that are drilled off of a surface pad. We're looking at geoscience delineation in the subsurface and capital project management. So that means that we can borrow from what's already there. Applicable regulatory, available infrastructure, expertise is huge. Data is huge. If you think about a mining project, any mining project in the world, they don't have the benefit of plunking that mining project down in the middle of the Alberta oil patch, where we have thousands of data points everywhere. Like, we have this geoscience down. It's a huge leg up in comparison to any other new lithium mine coming online. And then finally, diversification. That's a theme that's coming out with respect to our leaders, both provincially and federally. And conversations like this today, I think really build upon what we can do to leverage our strengths today into a diversified economy tomorrow. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to cut to the chase, like right away. And, I can answer a lot of technical questions after this, so feel free to just lay those on me later on, but I wanted to just talk about what does this mean? So E3's initial plan for production is a 20,000 ton per year project. So that's tons of lithium carbonate equivalent. So what that translates into is hundreds of jobs, both highly skilled jobs and labor and construction jobs. And also a little bit of market share. So it represented 2.5% of the global market share in 2025, which is not nothing. It's, you know, it's a decent chunk. Of course, revenues and taxes to the government, and value-added economic drivers. What I mean by that is we become a stable, secure source of supply of lithium to the world during a time that the world is screaming for lithium. That's going to attract other value-added manufacturing to the province. And as we scale that project up to 150,000 tons per year, that's hundreds of more jobs, potentially 8% of the global lithium demand in 2030. But that's not all. That's really just starting point. That's almost, I like to think of it as maybe even just the first domino. Because as soon as this gets proven in Alberta, this industry today, we're nascent. E3 is one of just a few players in this space in Alberta today. We've attracted attention and investment from international company, Livent Corporation, one of the largest lithium producers in the world. Once we get to the point where we're demonstrating this in a pilot plant, the world is going to be looking at Alberta because there's going to be a clear path towards stable, secure, and sustainably produced lithium in vast quantities. We actually have a global-sized resource of lithium in Alberta. We're very blessed in terms of our natural resources here. So how about the next slide? Okay, so wanted to touch on this really briefly. So this is a core value at E3. We are really looking at how do we, you know, not only making lithium to enable a low carbon economy, but how do we do that in a really sustainable way? How do we leverage Canada's green brand in mining and really do smart mining? And so we're looking at how we reduce the CO2 footprint of our lithium. We're looking at different CCS technologies to do that. The reality is the carbon intensity of hard rock mining is horrible. It's very high. Brine is much less, but you know, in Alberta, I think that we can do better and we can do it net zero. And so that's something that is a big priority for us for 2020. And it not only, you know, is kind of the right thing to do, but it also differentiates our product to our customers that are looking for this. They're looking for a pure product, number one. They're looking for security of supply, but they're also looking for that integrity of their supply chain to make sure that they're sourcing sustainably produced raw materials. Okay, so as far as this last question, you know, how does this become an economic engine for Alberta? There's 5 things that I've identified, and that's on the left. And on the right, I've put a picture of a conceptual model of what a commercial facility would look like, so you can have a picture of in your mind of where we're going with this. You can see, you know, there's some facilities and there's some wells and how this, you know, really does look a lot like oil and gas. So development support, number one. What does that mean? You know, developing a new industry requires capital. And the analogy I like is that SAGD would never have been a thing without industry support and government support. It was a technology that people thought was crazy and wacko in the 1980s, and now it's a conventional technology. And so we, you know, similar to SAGD, we need that sort of support, whether it's through grant funding, direct investment, and we need people working on this. Number 2, policy modifications. So I purposely said modifications. We need minor amendments to the already existing and effective policy that's in place to enable the growth of an industry. So policies have been defined largely for oil and gas or traditional mining. Small changes need to be made to enable this industry. Third, guidance on governance. So, you know, given the similarities of developing and producing lithium to oil and gas, you know, the AER already has the policies in place that only need minor adjustments. And you could think about this from the perspective of, you know, filling out a Directive 56 application and having a lithium checkbox there. Inactive wells, I always talk about this as being one of the biggest advantages of a project in Alberta, is we have all these sites that are available that we could repurpose. What does this mean? It means we're looking for a path to revitalize these inactive sites into lithium production, and you know, without and appropriately handling that liability piece. And finally, an industry association. So some of you may be familiar with the Canadian Lithium Association. We very recently pivoted that into the Battery Metals Association of Canada. And we are ultimately banding together with a wider group, a broader battery metal supply chain to ensure that we develop a thriving industry in Alberta and across the country, and aligning with not only provincial but federal mandates in that joint U.S. critical minerals strategy. And with that, I'm going to, there's one more slide that just welcomes your questions. I'm really excited to continue the conversation.